Good day, folks. This is Remembrance Day, and so I hope you were able to take a moment to um, honor, remember the men and women that have paid the ultimate sacrifice, that have privileged us and honored us in the lives that we lead, and that are in many ways still suffering today. And many of those are individuals with cancer, cancer survivors, or people who have lived with cancer. That being said, I'm excited about speaking today about a topic that is somewhat taboo, but also somewhat a challenge for people living with cancer, or what we term cancer survivors or survivors of cancer. And that is how we define somebody who's surviving cancer. I wouldn't say survived, I would say surviving cancer. If they are considered or viewed or perceived as wisdom carriers, or is the expectation of them, now that they have lived through cancer or are living with cancer, are they to become educators? And that's our topic today. I changed the format today a little bit in terms of how I'm presenting this. It's usually abstract and pretty pictures that I'll speak to. But today I changed it a little bit more to streamline it and create a bit of an avenue or an alleyway with which the presentation can flow. And I'll leave time at the end for questions if anybody would like any questions. But let's begin. I'll begin with a short introduction. I promise I'll keep it short of my background. So, folks, I've been in hospice palliative care for over 30 years, 3 decades. I know I don't look that old, but I've been in it for a very long time. And I've seen a lot of death, predominantly from cancer, but also ALS and Alzheimer's and what have you, but predominantly from cancer, because that's the dominating, really life-limiting illness that takes our lives in the end. And I've seen so much change in the 30 years that I have been in hospice palliative care. I've worked in numerous hospices across the province, across the country, down to the States, and into Trinidad and Tobago, and we're just about to go to Zimbabwe to help with some aspects of hospice palliative care there. And so that being said, I've also seen how caregivers companion, struggle, suffer, support a loved one who's living with cancer, whether that loved one survives the cancer or doesn't. And I've seen their plight in that. But today's topic is actually, interestingly, it's a little bit of a divergence from the whole caregiver role, which is my focus at Kensington Health. And we're going to focus on individuals who have survived cancer. That's me, many, many years ago, and somebody who actually was also living with cancer and surviving with cancer for many, many years. She has an amazing YouTube video with George Strombolopoulos, about her last, actually 2 weeks before she died. She had multiple tumors in her body and unknown primary cancer, and that's June Caldwood. And it's amazing how she talks about her cancer and how she doesn't talk about her cancer. She didn't use many occasions with which to teach cancer survival using her cancer. She advocated for social structures. She advocated for equity, diversity, inclusivity, accessibility to social services, but she didn't really take her cancer and educate people on survivorship of cancer or what to expect. And that's a theme that we're going to use today. I wish I had the opportunity to ask her why or why not she did or didn't do that. But in that particular instance, that wasn't the occasion for it. Currently, folks, I work at Kensington Health Center. I'm part of what's called the Second Mile Club, where I provide caregiver support, both in groups here at Kensington Health. I mean, I say here, online at Kensington Health and online at Wellspring, which is a phenomenal organization. I think we're so privileged to be in collaboration with Wellspring and the absolute expansion of services that they provide. But I also provide grief and bereavement support for individuals who are bereaved, who have had a loved one die or a family member or friend die at our hospice. And I work at bedside companion in the hospice and psychosocial support with my esteemed colleague, Evelyn Chung, who's the lead in psychosocial support. So it's quite a continuum of a program that I'm involved with, and I feel very fortunate. So, folks, I have the opportunity to see the journey of a life-limiting illness, such as cancer, from so many different angles, from caregivers to bedside companioning to psychosocial to grief and bereavement. And that's a unique perspective because I see how different people are affected by, the illness, and especially if the illness is survived, and what becomes of that individual and their family members if the illness is survived, such as cancer. But just want to be mindful today, folks, most of this is framed in the backdrop of COVID. Our numbers are quite high. What I mean by that, a lot of what I'm talking about today is information we've seen, in 30 plus years of non-COVID. Things have changed quite a bit because of what I would call the traumatization as caused by a pandemic, and how it's impacted even surviving cancer and still being threatened by a pandemic, or caregivers who are worried about, a loved one or a family member or friend who's survived cancer and still under threat of COVID. So what I'm going to speak today isn't so COVID focused. It's pre and hopefully post COVID, because we're still learning how COVID impacts survivorship with cancer, the trauma of a pandemic, and the impact it has even on caregivers who are providing care for someone living with cancer. So let's start with the whole notion of survivor, right? Somebody who's survived cancer and what that really means. And as I support people living with cancer and dying from cancer, their idea or perception of survivorship is very unique. It's tailored very, very individually. Some people actually don't even like the term survivor. I remember one gentleman said, well, I haven't survived this. I'm not going to live forever. This might take my life one day. It might not. He didn't like living in the idea of survivor. But when we've lived through an experience, when we've survived an experience, especially as a human being, you hear about people who've been through the Holocaust and survived the Holocaust. We often look to them as individuals with wisdom. They've experienced this possibly traumatizing event in their lives or events, and they've survived it. And it's sometimes assumed, and I think rightfully so, that they carry wisdom. They may carry, a bout of experience, a depth of experience of surviving those events or that event, and they may have knowledge, right? It's usually assumed somebody who survived an ordeal has knowledge, maybe about self, maybe about life, maybe about the natural order of things, but about navigation of that particular event, such as cancer. And they may have unique insights into what it means to live through an event, an ordeal, a disease, and come out the other side, still alive, right? Having survived it, being a survivor. And they set up a particular dynamic for that person. That's the whole notion of being a wisdom carrier. And what ends up happening is oftentimes somebody who's had such an experience, and I don't want to get too general in terms of survivorship of events and ordeals because we are talking about cancer, but you can relate it. I think you can relate it to survivorship of other events and ordeals and aspects and experiences and journeys that threaten our lives or threaten our well-being or threaten our way of life. And historically, especially when we're more community-based, I don't know if our communities are as tight as they used to be or as integrated, maybe outside the GTA, maybe in other countries, they most certainly are, such as my travels in South America and Africa and India. However, here in North America, especially in Southern Ontario, it's not as community-based as it once was 100, 200, 300 years ago, where the survival of the people depended on one another so much so. So given that, somebody who survived an ordeal, survived an illness, survived an event, may have a story. And historically, we used to share our stories from our elders to our juniors, our youngsters. We used to pass down traditionally knowledge, experience, insights, wisdom, right? And telling our stories to others. So it's quite normal and almost expected for somebody who's lived through an experience to share their story. right? To be a wisdom carrier of that. You know, hundreds of thousands of books have been written about my story, my story, my story, my story. Is that not so? So this particular story becomes, you know, what somebody might be classified as a wisdom carrier if they've survived cancer to share with others. You know, what's your story? How did you do it? What did you eat? What drugs did you take? What drugs didn't you take? Right? What did you feel? And how did you do this? But that sets up an interesting and yet sometimes challenging experience. And that is managing expectations. And what we're doing, folks, when somebody has lived through a particular ordeal and a particular experience, such as cancer, and survived it, there may be expectations from themselves, if not from others who have, you know, bared witness, supported, caregiver for that person who's lived through and survived the illness and survived cancer, to tell their story. It could be also obviously from friends and families. It could be, as I mentioned, even a community expectation of how did you do this? What happened? What did you do right? What did you do wrong? You know, how did this happen? And I think even as a public, sometimes there's this interest or curiosity, or especially if others are living with cancer, this need or want to hear somebody else's story so that they can relate to it, they can benefit from it, they can seek counsel and support from it. But that may set up an expectation to the person who lived with the cancer, who survived the cancer, that they themselves may not be autonomous with, they may not be aligned with. So that sense of expectation can be quite a burden on somebody who's lived with cancer, survived cancer, as imposed by an environment of people. And that brings us to the idea that when somebody has lived an ordeal such as, or an experience such as cancer, or an illness such as cancer, they have their own unique story. And I put this very importantly in italics, bolded it, and quotation marked it. Because if we are going to tell our story of surviving cancer, maybe we have to manage the expectations of others, the general public, and even our friends and families, that this is my story, but only my story, right? The one thing I'm very mindful of in the 3 decades I've worked in this field of death and dying and trauma and grief and bereavement, nobody's story is generalized. Nobody's story is even closely similar to somebody else's story. Just because one person's mother died of pancreatic cancer doesn't make it similar or the same as somebody else's mother dying of pancreatic cancer. It depends on so many factors. So we have to be very mindful that when these expectations are laid on somebody who survived cancer, I hope we can be mindful and remember that it's a very personal experience. Their story may relate to us in some ways. In many ways, it won't relate to us. And I think a lot of us might get stuck there in seeing somebody else's story, relating to it, and expecting our story to be as such. I think we can gain wisdom and insights and what have you, but they can also be very biased. They can be biased because it's that person's psychological, emotional, existential, spiritual, religious, physical makeup that's traveled that journey. It's extremely unique. And it won't be necessarily completely applicable to everyone else. And you might see where I'm going with this, is that if that person takes their story and is expected to tell it, to teach others as a wisdom carrier, it's a biased, unique, individual, and in many ways exceptional story. We can take things from it, but to burden somebody with the expectation of telling their story so that we all learn from it, it's something that has to be seen through the lens of uniqueness, individuality, and bias. I think that's an important piece. The other thing is that I've actually heard this from cancer survivors, is that they say, why do people hear my story? It's my story. This is what happened to me. It's not going to happen, might not happen to you like that. It might not happen to somebody else. This is my story. I can tell you my story, but it's important for you to recognize it's my story. And at many times when we are supporting somebody who's living with cancer, or we ourselves are living with cancer, hanging on to hope in any regard keeps us resilient, keeps us fighting, keeps us going, keeps us grounded. But it also biases us if we look to other people's stories and expect them to share with us that which might not relate to us. And I think that's an often not spoken of experience of somebody who's living with cancer sharing their story. So let's just be mindful when that expectation is laid on friends and family who are living with cancer, that it is their story. There's an ownership to it. There's an autonomy and self-direction in it. And in that autonomy and self-direction, there has to be some choice with which they share or not. Now, a beautiful model, folks, that I advocate for very strongly here at Lighthouse for Grieving, at Kensington Health with our caregiver program, at Wellspring with Caregiver Connect, and at Lighthouse for Grieving Children, where I'm part of an organization where we support children who are bereaved, who are grieving because they've lost a family member. There's a model called the lived experience model. It's a peer support model. Now, that peer support model is when we take my story of living with cancer or supporting somebody living with cancer, and I share it with other people. And when I share it with others, it's the hope that my story is some way relatable to what you're going through. But the key with the peer support model, folks, right? The key with the peer support model is the fact that it's autonomous and self-directed. There is no expectation by friends and family and acquaintances and community and society and the public for somebody who's lived through cancer and survived it to tell their story. In a peer support model, which are the groups that we run here at Kensington and Wellspring, the peer support model, yes, we have lived experience as a survivor of cancer. Yes, we have lived experience as a caregiver for somebody who's living with cancer or survived cancer. But the foundation of that is that there's no expectation, no burden of proof to share our story, my story. Peer support models very, very closely linked with empowerment, autonomy, choice, and self-direction of not just about sharing my story, but how much of my story I want to share. When I've talked to people who have survived cancer, the pressure on them sometimes to tell their whole story, how they've survived cancer, is huge. People, as we seek hope from somebody who survived, especially an illness such as cancer, we want to know every little bit detail. Tell me about this and tell me about that. And how did you do this? And when did you eat? And when did you go to the bathroom? And how did you talk? And what drug did you, what doctor did you see? It's not peer support. It's not autonomous. It's not self-directed. The expectation on somebody to share their story as such is common and can be quite damaging and quite traumatizing. We'll speak to that in a little bit. But I just want to reiterate, telling your story within a peer support model is different from the expectations experienced by someone who survived cancer in a general public or between family and friends in regard to sharing their story, right? It's a lot more autonomy, self-direction, empowerment, boundaries, and safety and permissioning with which how much of their story can be told. I'm ahead of my slides. And that's the aspect of choice. When expectation is put or experienced by someone who survived cancer to tell their story, especially to families and friends, a lot of the choice is taken out of it. And let me ask you, and I've heard this from survivors of cancer, it's a feeling of guilt, is that does somebody who survived cancer, do they need to tell their story? Is it a responsibility? Is it an accountability? Do they have to, or do they have a choice to say, no, I need to keep this with me. I'll tell you maybe a little bit here and there. Maybe I'll write a book. Maybe I'll do a blog, but maybe I don't want to say anything. There should be a choice to it. There should be a choice to somebody who survived cancer, who oftentimes, when somebody survived cancer, how do we usually see them? We see them as, the battle. They won the battle. They beat cancer. They are heroes. They are resilient. They are super people. There's so much perception and bias and conditions put on somebody who survived cancer, rightfully or wrongfully so. That's a whole other, they've conquered cancer. But that conquering, however you define it, may be something that's so unique and individual and personal that their choice is not to share it for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about. Are they afforded the autonomy and self-direction not to share those aspects of their story or to share their story at all if they so choose? And unfortunately, in most circles, when we hear about somebody who survived cancer, especially closer knit circles, there is an expectation, as told by survivors of cancer, to tell their story, to share their insights, to share their wisdom, to share their strategies, practical, physiological, existential strategies, to tell who they prayed to, right? What religion they belong to, what community, what is their DNA. And that can be oftentimes quite violating and quite a pressure on somebody who's survived cancer. I love what this gentleman told me. He says, I haven't survived it, I am surviving it. He kept it in the present. One of his boundaries that he would often tell people when they heard that he had beat cancer, he says, I haven't beat it, I'm surviving it, right? And it wasn't because he felt there's still cells in his body and it's metastasized. No. When we survive cancer, folks, it's not just the cancer that we are surviving. We are surviving the diagnosis, the experience of the diagnosis, the changes and losses and griefs and bereavements that we've had in the change of lifestyle, in having cancer. And if the cancer is gone, what has remained that has impacted us, hurt us, changed us is part of surviving the cancer. So I loved how he said it. He says, I'm living what has happened to me. And I'm surviving the cancer, even though the cancer is gone, because I'm still dealing with what cancer did to me, right? So let's be mindful that there's a choice there. And let's be mindful also when somebody who survived cancer is expected. And this is not to take away when somebody wants to tell their story. That's the easy part, right? If they want to tell their story or parts of their story, by all means. But if for a large number of population who have survived cancer or surviving cancer, they don't want to, there's this expectation that they have to as wisdom carriers, as I mentioned. Let's just be mindful and compassionate, empathetic that they should have choice with what they want to share, because they're still going through what has happened to them, even though there may be no remnants, no signs and symptoms of the disease itself. And when we look at the whole aspect of being a wisdom carrier, especially for somebody who's experienced surviving cancer, there is an aspect of an expectation or even an opportunity to teach about the experience, to facilitate learning about the experience, to share about the experience. But let's not burden them that they are not only that they are carrying a wisdom that they need to share with other people. Let's not put it on them and have them, and as I've heard from people who survived cancer, that they feel guilty if they don't share it because the wisdom is being carried with them, right? We call it wisdom carrying, right? That they should teach it and share it. And then I remember this one individual, she said to me, she says, people call me selfish that I don't tell them what happened and how I beat this or how I survived, right? Imagine that. Now, who's being, opportunistic and selfish if we burden somebody or judge them or classify them in the context that they are not sharing that which they don't necessarily have to share, because we don't know the entire picture. We also have to be mindful that, as I've just mentioned, even though they are not living with the disease anymore, they're living with the experience of the disease. And the traumatization, the experience of traumatization of a diagnosis with cancer, even if it's survived, even if it's beaten, even if it's conquered, still lives with our bodies, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, existentially. It's there. The cancer's gone. The experience of the cancer may not be, and may be there for a lifetime. Right? There's some great work, folks, and research done by a number of people, Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Bruce Perry, about the impact even of the time of diagnosis of cancer and the traumatizing aspect of that. So that lives with us. And that's a mindful piece. And why I say that is that when somebody's sharing their story, we have to be mindful that they may still be living their story. Okay, it's not an ending. So survivorship of cancer doesn't necessarily end there. The story continues because the memory, the experience might be imprinted on their life experience. And so what ends up happening for people who have survived cancer often is this feeling that they're burdened educators. There's this, expectation, this responsibility, this, this duty, this accountability. There's this expectation from people to educate others. You've been through it. You lived. I'll never forget this one person who survived cancer. She said to me, somebody said to her, you were given a second chance. Do your duty and tell us how it was for you so that we can learn from you, because some of us won't have that second chance. Imagine the burden of that, right? It wasn't enough that she had survived cancer, been through all the ordeal of surviving stage 3, I can't remember, colorectal cancer. It was this burden put on by somebody else. And she felt that burden was just as hard as living with the cancer. And then there's this responsibility piece, especially in a sense of community, even in family, this proposed or projected responsibility that if you have another individual who survived cancer told me they were told this way. She said, you were chosen to live through cancer and survive it. You were given, this cancer and you survived it by however. It's your responsibility now to help others survive their cancer. Imagine the burden on that person's life. Imagine, the lack of awareness and somewhat ignorance in that they may still be living with the effects of the cancer, right? And so in some circles, you hear this term of duty, right? Well, it's my duty now to protect my friends and family from what they may experience if they have cancer and they live with it and they are geared towards surviving it. They felt this sense of duty. Now, who's projecting that duty? If it's internal, innate, autonomous, and self-directed, by all means, if you feel a sense of responsibility and duty. But I sit with people who are living with cancer, especially who doesn't look like it's necessarily terminal, or they're going to die from it anytime soon. And we explore this sense of responsibility and duty. Where does it come from? Is it familial? Is it cultural? Is it religious? Is it projected onto them? Where's that sense of duty coming from? And where is their autonomy and choice in how they navigate their survivorship of cancer? It's very interesting. In hospice palliative care, folks, we focus a lot on autonomy and self-direction, and we do a lot of that empowerment, safety, permission, and self-direction when it comes to living with cancer or dying from cancer. But somehow, once you survived it, it's almost all bets are off. Well, you survived it, you beat it, so you've lost the autonomy and self-direction and a sense of empowerment because you need to tell us your story now. You need to tell us how you did what you did, right? Why does that happen? Why is it, when somebody's living with cancer, as much as possible, we focus on, their own choice, their own empowerment and how they navigate the cancer, whether they want chemo, how much chemo, they want radiation, whether they want to do alternative therapies, whether they want to see people, however they want to do it, right? For a lot of we try to as much as possible. And then somebody survives cancer and all of a sudden we take away that responsibility, take away that autonomy, put the responsibility, duty on them, and then hold them accountable for telling their story. I mean, what a burden on somebody. What happened to the compassion and empathy that was there before when they were living and battling the cancer, that when they survived it, that compassion and empathy is dissipated and disappears? We have to be really mindful of that and not burden somebody who survived cancer with our own needs and what have you. I say that, folks, I hope sensitively, because it's a lot of resources out there, folks, that we can access. And I'm going to give you some that we don't necessarily need to burden somebody who survived cancer with any measure of responsibility, duty, or expectation for them to tell us their story, to tell us, what they learned in navigating cancer. Because, folks, what can actually end up happening, and unfortunately I've seen this far too often, what can actually end up happening is a sense of re-traumatization. Living with cancer, beating it, seeking treatment for it, being diagnosed with it, is more often than not, and this is something that's not spoken to very often, traumatizing. It's traumatizing from the moment of diagnosis or even from the moment of suspicion that somebody has cancer. And what the trauma does, what the traumatization does, is create a sense of being overwhelmed, right? Not being able to cope. And it leaves a memory, an imprint in somebody's mind of the experience. The journey through cancer, and I'm sure people who are possibly on the line today, the caregivers, they can tell you, right? Watching a loved one live with cancer is both traumatizing for the person living with the cancer and for themselves. I mean, how could it not be? Your life is being threatened. And if it's not being threatened in the sense that it's going to take your life, it's going to kill you, it's being threatened in your way of life and all the multiple losses that occur with that. And even with the perception of a future of safety, of not having remission. Okay, that's another piece of traumatization. And that trauma, that experience of traumatization lives in our bodies. It goes into our cells. It goes into our physicality. It's somaticized into our body. Now, when we ask, if you just hold that thought, and we ask somebody who's lived and survived cancer to retell their stories out of duty, responsibility, accountability, and expectation, what are we doing? Oftentimes, we're asking them to reconnect with the trauma of having cancer, to reconnect with that experience. And what can happen when we reconnect with it involuntarily, because oftentimes what happens with trauma is that it's repressed, buried, compartmentalized, it's put somewhere. We ask somebody to retell their story, to teach others about their survivorship or their survival through cancer. We're asking them to get back in touch with that trauma without necessarily taking into account that that person may not have the skills, ability, or even, want to touch that traumatization again. They've created coping strategies that are possibly effective in managing that trauma of living with cancer, even though they've survived it. Asking them to teach us or teach others of that survivorship is somewhat asking them to touch that trauma again, because it's unlikely somebody who has been traumatized to be able to tell their story and give advice and speak to their experience without touching that trauma again, without having that trauma be infused in some way. So they may re-experience that which they experienced during their journey through cancer, during living with cancer, during their survivalship of cancer. They may relive it knowingly or unknowingly, because a lot of trauma lives in our unconscious minds. It lives in our bodies. It's a separation, a disconnection even from our bodies and minds. And it's a disconnection or even a dissociation from that because it's so hard and so difficult and so much suffering and pain in it. So we might actually have those experiences resurface when somebody's expected to teach, especially if it's not autonomous or wanted or self-directed. This expectation may have them relive it, re-experience it, have a lot of the experiences of the trauma of living and even beating cancer resurface. And that could be counter-healing. When somebody's survived cancer or is surviving cancer, it doesn't mean that once they have no more incidence or evidence of the disease means they are healed. The healing will happen probably over a lifetime, even if the cancer never returns. It's the trauma and impact of the cancer, and living through cancer, despite its survivalship, that will be a measure of healing. So we have to be very mindful, because sometimes telling our stories and speaking our truths and helping others and teaching others can be very healing if it's autonomous, if it's wanted, if it's not an expectation, a burden, a duty, a responsibility, if the person wants to do it. And we hear that all the time. One of my favorite is, Christopher Reeves telling his story, or, Terry Fox's story is one of the most amazing, inspiring stories of cancer, even though there wasn't a survivorship. But those are autonomous. It's the ones that are not autonomous, meaning it's not free will, it's not choice to teach, to give counsel, to support their experience and tell their story, is where we can end up with re-traumatization. I try to advocate for people when they hear and they want to know someone's story, especially in surviving cancer, is just be mindful that somebody who survived cancer may still be healing from the survivorship, right? A new normal for them for years and years and years. And if we do put these expectations on them and want them to teach us what they know, and sometimes it's, unfortunately it's aggressive, folks, because of this sense of, you survived it, you've been given a second chance for whatever reason, maybe it was a God's gift or however they define it, that they should teach others and help others. but it could actually be re-traumatizing and actually be quite damaging and counter healing to that person. So please keep that in mind, when you, even for yourselves, if you are living and if you've survived cancer, I hope these will speak to any experience or feelings of duty and responsibility, because they are sometimes the information piece that creates boundaries. They're sometimes the pieces that help us create boundaries, because we recognize, oh, I can be re-traumatized by this. They're expecting me to do this, but I can be re-traumatized. I'm still healing. So I have a right and a need to say no, or to not tell the whole story, or to create boundaries. I advocate very strongly for somebody, even from the time of diagnosis, who's living through cancer and surviving cancer, to develop boundaries in terms of what they are comfortable in sharing, what they don't have to share, who is the pressure, where is the pressure coming from, in the sense of expectation, responsibility to share their story, why they feel they have to share their story, but they don't want to, right? What is the feelings possibly even of guilt or pressure or unfortunate, even sometimes passive aggressive actions to get somebody to tell their story, right? It involves a little bit of awareness of why we don't want to and how we can say we don't want to, or we can't, or that we are in a measure of still healing from it, or we're still, I go back to what that gentleman said. He would say, I'm surviving cancer, right? And that would shut people up for the most part, because then they'd be like, oh, you still have it? He's like, no, but I'm still managing the experience of it, that I'm still healing. I'm still living with the experience. It's about also, in terms of boundaries, is creating communication or around what is happening to the healing process as surviving cancer, that it's not over, right? The cancer might be gone, but the healing from it may not be, right? And communicating that with family, friends, public, community, however, right? And that's part of the boundaries, or even recognizing why we can't communicate it. And that takes a bit of self-reflection, self-compassion, self-introspection of what about me is, for lack of a better word, succumbing to these measures of drawing my experience from me. I love how this one individual, she said they take it from me. She imitated Al Pacino in The Godfather Part 3. She goes, every time I leave, they pull me back in. And she said that in terms of the way she does it, her accent, it's amazing. The way she was trying to explain that, every time she was trying to gain some measure of healing and empowerment and safety for herself, she was drawn back into her story by people asking how she did it. How did she survive cancer? And putting that burden of wisdom carrier and teacher on her when she really didn't want to. She just wanted to continue her healing. She had survived, and she said, I just want to carry on with my life. So we worked on creating boundaries, bringing an awareness of why and how she could or could not say, I want to keep this story to me. I want to keep my teachings, and she wouldn't even call them teachings, my learnings to me. These are for me. And communicating that to other people without feeling a sense of guilt or feeling selfish in that she didn't do it. And that was a form of self-compassion for her, right? Imagine, you've just lived through cancer. Where's the compassion in healing from it and carrying your story forward? And again, this goes without saying in terms of people who want to share. Like I said, there's tons of books out there. I believe one by June Calder called 12 Weeks in Spring, right? All about life-limiting illnesses and cancer and what have you. So, and that takes us to a sense of what permissioning. Permissioning is not really a word, folks. My colleague and I, we created by adding ing on it, but it's a verb, right? And oftentimes when I support people who are surviving cancer or living through cancer, we look at the aspects of caring for themselves by setting boundaries and communicating what they're okay with, what they're truly okay with, and what they're not, or recognizing through self-reflection why they can't communicate and how they can't communicate that which they do not want to do. And that's a measure of self-love, a measure of self-compassion, a great deal of self-awareness, to permission ourselves not to have to become wisdom carriers. Just because we have wisdom, just because we have experience and knowledge of the trials and tribulations of living and surviving cancer, should not establish the expectations, accountability, and responsibility with which we need to share with others and tell with others if we don't want to. And that can change through a lifetime. We can go through stages where it can be healing to tell our story, to share, to help, especially within a peer support model. And then we withdraw from it. And then we re-engage it. But the commonality in there is autonomy. The commonality in there is the self-direction in it, that we want to, when we want to, how we want to, and how much we want to. I think that's the permissioning that we have to be focused on. And that's the principle that needs to carry over from the time somebody's battling cancer, living with cancer, conquering cancer, to, post survivorship, or, in that regard, that their self-direction autonomy is maintained through the entire journey of living with cancer and into remission or into survivorship. Because of this actual principle, folks, the measure of healing of somebody who's survived cancer or surviving cancer is lifetime. And it can be impeded, it can be even destroyed and ruined and infected and tarnished, however you want to define it, if somebody is pushed through an expectation of telling their story or speaking their story, right? That burden can be detrimental to their healing process. The healing process is really an important autonomous piece. People, we advocate as much as possible for people to seek their own healing. It doesn't mean doing it alone. It's just doing it the way that may resonate and align with their principles and their values, right? That may work for them, right? Especially within a peer support model, because we have to be mindful of some of the things that I've already spoken to, the trauma and traumatization of living with cancer, the grief that's experienced in living with cancer, like the loss of a perception of what life would have been like, or is supposed to be like, or will be like. I've heard people, who have survived cancer saying, a part of my innocence has been lost. And they grieve that innocence because they said, I will always wonder if it's going to come back, right? I'm in remission, but will it recur? And they lost that sense of predictability, that perception of safety for a life forward. There's a grief in that. Yes, they're going to live with it. Yes, they're continue on in survivorship. But there's a loss, there's experience of grief in that we have to be mindful of. And that's part of the healing process. And that's why this particular individual did not want to become an educator in survivorship of cancer, right? There's also, folks, a recalibration. I mean, we're always changing. We're dynamic beings, right? We're always changing, recalibrating, grounding as we live through life and live through experiences. But I don't find anywhere is that as important or as powerful as when we've survived an illness that could have taken our lives, and regardless of the measure of diagnosis. There's a recalibration of our life, and it's a constant recalibration. Who am I now? How has this affected me? How has this, changed me? How has it changed my environment, my wants, my perception, my spirituality, my religious ideology, my sense of self? And that recalibration is a very important piece that can be affected detrimentally when somebody's pushed into becoming a teacher of their story, because they're still trying to figure out what's happening to them. And then trying to figure out and recalibrate their life can take a lifetime. And if they don't want to be in a sense of expectation to tell others what has happened to them, that recalibration can be actually cut off or thwarted, right? And then the measure of healing is also affected in that regard. And healing, especially from a disease as cancer, is lifelong, folks, not just physically, but in all the other measures that we spoke about. There's a lifelong aspect to this. If that measure of healing is also, it also is catalyzed by teaching, facilitating, sharing their story with others, which happens a lot, right? In many circles, in many mediums, by all means. I'm speaking to today to the expectation, duty, and responsibility that is burdened on people that don't want to, but feel they have to, especially from those closest to them, such as family and friends. Because, folks, you don't need to do that. We don't need to put expectations on people who survived cancer. I've heard this from a number, I say 2 or 3 people who survived cancer, that they become an anomaly. They become, they become special right? And that's why, people want to touch them to see how they did it. I mean, metaphorically touch them. But we don't have to. There's an enormous volume of resources today with the advent of the internet, with the advent of social media, with the advent of online platforms. There's so much with which we can gain knowledge and wisdom and understanding and awareness, without having to, and I hope I say this sensitively, hurt people who have survived cancer by expecting them to share their wisdom. There's in our at Kensington Health and at Wellspring, we have a fantastic peer support model where people come, and some just listen, right? People come who are caregivers, right? But also people who are living with illnesses, and they can share their stories. They can share it to the extent they want to the depth they want to, or not at all, and in that way seek wisdom and understanding. But it's autonomous and self-directed. We have one-on-one, like myself. I support people one-on-one who are living with a terminal illness such as cancer, or their caregivers who are supporting them, or secondary, tertiary caregivers who are bearing witness to a loved one supporting someone else with cancer. We can provide one-on-one support for that, and as in other organizations. There's a vast volume of books where we can receive knowledge and wisdom and understanding from people who have lived through an experience such as cancer and survived it, and tell their stories. But they tell their stories, in a boundaried way. Here's my book, right? Here's my website. Here's my blog. A lot of people blog. I should have put blogs on there, but I put it under media. There's a lot of movies. There's a great one right now called Clouds on Disney, which is, again, telling the story. I mean, he doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a story about survivorship of cancer, but the medium is the same, right? Whereas there's still this boundary where we're not, superimposing expectations and responsibility and duty on somebody. And then there's a whole gamut of social media and media platforms with which we can receive that support for somebody who survived cancer. For somebody who's surviving cancer, the work that I've done with someone as such is to help to understand, as I mentioned before, I'm almost done, help understand where is it that we struggle, and sometimes can we refer somebody, especially family and friends, to other resources with which they can gain a more generalized, a more vast, a more appropriate and aligned context of support, right? Such as the resources provided. All right, folks, that is my spiel today. That's my talk for today. It's shorter than usual because it's a specific topic. My contact information is there. Please email me as you wish. I'm happy to answer any questions and provide resources. I just advocate very strongly. Let's have some compassion for those who have survived cancer and are still in a measure of healing. Let's not re-traumatize them. For people who've survived cancer, who would like support on how to set stronger boundaries, how to say no, right? Or how to find other ways with which to share their story without necessarily exposing themselves and being traumatized, such as blogs and such as social media platforms. There are ways that it can be done. So thank you very much, folks. Stay safe out there. Numbers are climbing, and we look forward to seeing you again on this platform.